Chinese Hero released in Japanese arcades in 1984, but its port to the Famicom sparked a series of home releases that barely saw the light of the early 2000s, but did give us one of the greatest game series titles of all time. Super Chinese. So I don't think the fact that it is Chinese is any funny. On the contrary, I think it's really funny because the developer and publisher for most of the games on the series is Culture Brain, who is from, you guessed it, Japan. Obviously, China doesn't have a great history with video games. Video games weren't really allowed there for a long time until like the N64 era, when there was the IQ, which was like Nintendo's partnership with the Chinese government, I'm pretty sure, to release video games there. But for the most part, yeah, like the fact that this is Chinese has absolutely nothing to do with the game series. It's just the title. But I think it's really funny because it's a Japanese series. I don't know. I also think it's really funny when we get like Japanese games about American culture. I don't know. I just think it's really funny. Either way, we've talked about this series before in different episodes. I've shown off Super Chinese 1, 2, and 3 on Famicom, Super Chinese Land 1 and 2 on the original Game Boy, and Super Chinese World 1 and 2 on Super Famicom. But in this video, we're going to go over the last 5 main games, 5 non-compilation games that I was missing, all of which were, again, developed and published by Culture Brain, who is pretty much the parent developer on these games. And outside of Super Chinese, they haven't really done a whole lot. They've done baseball games, and they've done pet/animal-based games. So, like, those are Super Chinese, baseball, and animal games, 3 very different, it's a very weird variety of games, but they do have a good variety of other weird things. But, such is the life of a Japanese developer in the 80s and 90s, I guess. I don't know. So one more thing I'll note before I actually show off the games is that none of the games in this video have come to North America. The series has come to North America under different titles. Typically, the Chinese would be replaced with Ninja, because I think North America would go ballistic if like a race-related name was in a title. I don't know, whatever it is. I think it was like Super Ninja Boy or Ninja Boy. I think those were some games here in North America, but the specific games in this video have not released in North America. So, with that said, let's get right into it. The first game I'm going to show is the last Super Chinese Land, Super Chinese Land 3, which released in January 1995 on the original Game Boy, of course, where you play as the main character brothers of the series, Jack and Ryu, 2 very different names at that, but they try and handle an alien invasion on the Imperial City. So that's really all I can say. Like I said, I had the first 2. The story for a lot of these games doesn't super matter. It's more of the action RPG and beat-em-up style combat, like that kind of makes it unique, kind of a little different. That's really all I could say about the game. But similarly, at the end of 1995, we got Super Chinese World 3, Choujigen Daisakusen, which is it has a similar storyline to Super Chinese Land 3, but some alternate universes are at play story-wise. Gameplay-wise, though, there is the typical action RPG beat-em-up combo, but there's also a turn-based RPG mode, both of which have different plots and endings, in addition to the regular mode with the regular story. Kind of weird, kind of also doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but still kind of neat. And if I didn't see the release dates of these games, I would have told you that Super Chinese World 3 came out first, and then Super Chinese Land 3 was a cut-down version of Super Chinese World 3. We kind of had that before. Like Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo had a very cut-up version, Donkey Kong Land on the original Game Boy, which is kind of interesting, kind of funny. But no, not in this case. Land 3 came out beginning of 1995, and World 3, the Super Famicom version, released at the end of 1995. So kind of the other way around. My guess would be that this is a little bit more fleshed out than Land 3, but so it goes. A little different from Donkey Kong Country. It's actually going to kind of do something with the next game, but like Donkey Kong Country has its Super Nintendo release, had a cut-up version that kind of became its own thing on the original Game Boy, and then on the Game Boy Color did we get a more accurate representation. Let me come back to that, though. So those were the only two mainline games I was missing. The mainline is the 3 Super Chinese on Famicom, Super Chinese Land 1, 2, and 3 on Game Boy, and Super Chinese World 1, 2, and 3 on Super Famicom. But there was their own little spin-off of fighting games. So, not that I know anything about fighting games at all, but, I famously don't really like fighting games. I think a lot of fighting games look very similar. But, so can you believe that there's fighting games that I want to talk about? Here we go. So, first of all is Super Chinese Fighter, releasing 10 days before Super Chinese Land 3, that first game that we showed. So 10 days before, still in January 1995, but instead of being an action RPG / beat 'em up, this is a 2D fighter spin-off where you can play as one of 14 characters, including Jack and Ryu, but the story is about a Dark Lord in search of ancient scrolls, so obviously the brothers need to go stop him. Again, story doesn't super matter for these games, but there's the fighting mode, of course, and there's also a circuit mode where you choose one of the 14 characters, fight everyone else, and you unlock new moves that way. So that is actually pretty cool. Now, actually kind of similar to the Donkey Kong Country example I was giving before, releasing almost 2 years after that one, we got Super Chinese Fighter GB, releasing in December 1996. And this one, I can more confidently say, is a cut-down version of Super Chinese Fighter. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty straightforward, but then again, following the Donkey Kong Country formula, if you will, we got Super Chinese Fighter EX, which is the most I had to spend on a game in this series. It was like $40. The other ones are pretty cheap, but like this one was like $40. So this released on Game Boy Color on Christmas Eve 1999, almost 5 full years since the initial Super Chinese Fighter on Super Famicom. So again, followed a similar formula as the Donkey Kong Country games. This one had the least amount of information on any of the games I had to talk about here. But aside from it being the only Game Boy Color game to release in the series, it is also the last, mostly original game in the series. So I mean, it's based on the Super Famicom game, but it's the last like non-compilation we'll go with. So that's that. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But this, again, I don't mean to keep bringing up Donkey Kong Country, but is very similar to like the Game Boy Color port, where this is a lot more accurate to the Super Famicom release, sitting somewhere in terms of power between the Game Boy one and the Super Famicom one. So not really surprising. I would say the only thing added besides like color capability compared to the original Game Boy is that there's a training mode. For $19.99, I don't know, but this was a fun one to get. I was like, all right, well, I got all the other ones. I guess I gotta bite the bullet on this one. So that's all the new games that I got, and it's cool to complete the main series of Super Chinese games, but it's not the only games released. I am 99% sure there are only 3 more games remaining. So the first two, there is Super Chinese Land 1, 2, 3 Dash on original Game Boy, which, if I had to guess, is a compilation of Super Chinese Land 1, 2, and 3. Then there's another one, Super Chinese 1 and 2 Advance on Game Boy Advance. So that's a compilation of the first 2 games from the Famicom. And those 2 compilations, either I couldn't find on eBay or they are really expensive. So those 2, obviously the Game Boy one didn't release in the 2000s, but the Game Boy Advance one did. And that's like as far as Super Chinese has seen the light of the early 2000s. So like, that's kind of sad. I'm pretty sure the series is completely dead outside of that. There was also a PS2 compilation, which I think it's a compilation of a whole bunch of games, and Super Chinese just happens to be one of them, not like a compilation of Super Chinese games. So the PS2 and the Game Boy Advance ones, only ones really to be released in the early 2000s. But I think since then, absolutely nothing. So I'll come across those at some point. The first 2, the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance one, I'm pretty sure I saw. PS2 one, I can't find anything about that. That one's just gone like the wind, so to speak. I think it's in a line of like compilation titles, so I'd have to find info about like the entire series of compilations. So anyway, that's all I got. This is a pretty short one, but that's okay. It's fine. We don't have to always talk for like 45 minutes, but it's fine. It's fine. So with that said, I hope you learned something about Super Chinese. Maybe you've played Ninja Boy or Super Ninja Boy or any of the other games in this series, at least in North America. But as always, I hope you learned something. If there's anything I missed at all, anything I got wrong, please correct me. Please let me know. Information about this series is a little obscure, a little hard to find. So if there's stuff that that I don't, I would love to learn about these games because I think just again the title is so funny. I don't know. So that's that. I'll see you next week. But until then, bye.